My name is Victor Furman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. As humans, we ask a lot of questions. Many question our existence, our purpose in life, and our connection with the divine as we may or may not perceive it. What if we had the opportunity to sit face to face with great figures from our respective faiths, share coffee or tea and a meal, and ask them to share about their lives, ministries, and transitions? What would we learn and how would it affect our personal beliefs and paths? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, David Collis, did just that. Through extensive historical, biblical, and textual research, he developed a thought experiment. His thesis, what would it be like to interview Jesus of Nazareth? A native of Southern California, author David Collis is versed in the humanities, art, and religion, and holds a master's degree in fine art. David is an artist, photographer, carpenter, and designer of a new series of sacred symbols. He characterizes his life as a quest driven by the romance of exploration and invention. His website is davidcollis.com, and he joins me this week to discuss his groundbreaking, surprising, and enlightening book, Interviewing Jesus the Man. Please welcome to Destination Unlimited, David Collis.
And thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm grateful to a mutual friend, for Mark Eddy, for bringing us together, because I think your book is fabulous, and I think our listeners will gain a lot of insight into your process. Now, let's share your personal and spiritual path prior to entertaining this amazing thought experiment. What was your early life like? What were your goals, and what was your spiritual path?
I grew up near the beach. It's actually on the beach, surfing and being in the ocean. And my father was a contractor. My grandfather was a builder. He had a building contracting business, and he built homes. And my father, when he married his daughter, was able to be brought into the business, and he learned the business from the ground up. And so I was involved with construction kind of at an early age. He took me around the construction sites. I loved big construction equipment, and I loved the ocean, and I loved playing sports.
Okay. And what was your spiritual path like at that time?
Well, during as a child, one, I was always having many, many dreams. And two, I was very creative when it came to paints and making things. And I found myself having very interesting ideas that I felt were fairly advanced for a youngster, like the power of the mind and visualization and things like that. So I think back in the 60s and the 70s, there was the Bermuda Triangle, and there's the Chariots of the Gods, and I just found those books inspirational.
Yes, I grew up in the same period of time and had the same experience. So tell us, you had your young life around the construction field, then talk about your education and your career.
I first wanted to start off my life as a pilot, but that didn't turn out the way that I wanted. And instead, I ended up having an existential crisis. And that really kind of turned my whole life around. And it put me on a path that what I would characterize as an odyssey. And it was one of trying to answer questions, like the big questions. Who am I? Who's God? Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? And things like that. And so I ended up kind of dealing with an apprenticeship of consciousness through art and spirituality and understanding the world's religions.
And what was your art like?
At first, it was all very representational, and I kind of was interested in the like photorealism. But as I got older and I started to mature, my work became more abstract. So I found that I had an aptitude to kind of go deep and to experience art in an abstract manner. And so the pieces that and the paintings that I deal with today are all abstract images, and Neo Geo, as the new term is geometric abstraction.
And a little more about your art. Tell us about these sacred symbols that you're creating.
Yeah, so they started off in about 1988, and I would just spend 4 or 5 hours kind of in a bit of a trance-like experience where I was just doodling. And at the end of these sessions, I would have all of these shapes and symbols, and then I just would kind of keep expanding on those. And then finally I got my first computer. I think that was around 1992 or 93, and I was able to teach myself AutoCAD, and so I was able to transfer some of those geometric drawings into the computer, and then everything just really started to take off and blast off from there.
And how do you relate those to the sacred?
Well, these are very deep unconscious symbols, and they focus in on like resonance patterns, and they have a geometry to them that have been inspired by what you would refer to as sacred geometry and the flower of life and the tree of life and that type of inspiration. But I ended up making symbols. That was like the foundation, I should say. The sacred geometry was a foundation, and then I just started to build my symbols off of that. So there's kind of several types. There's types that would look like they were an ancient alphabet, and then there's a whole nother group that are inspired by symmetry or radial symmetry or mirrored symmetry. So.
And are these available to be seen on your website?
Yes, there is. I'm going to say there's probably 40. I'm going to say somewhere around 40 or 50 symbols on my website. Yeah, you can see them.
And that website is davidcolliss.com.
Not double S.
I'm sorry, single S.com. davidcollis.com. I'm sorry about that.
That's correct. Yeah.
So,
and then also at the top of each chapter of my book, I also have one of the symbols that I made, and I have probably in my library and in my archives almost 1,000. So they have a feel that's like the crop circles, but then there's also things that are more like resonant patterns, as you would find in the vibration of sound.
Okay. And readers will see that when they get a hold of your book. Now, it's 2 millennia. And people have theologians, historians, people of philosophy have been looking at the life of Jesus of Nazareth for all of that time. What made you decide to take on the enormous challenge of interviewing Jesus as your first book?
My life in Christianity has a lot of ins and outs and turns and twists, and so there wasn't any direct path that I had when it comes to this particular religion, but my family was Episcopal on both sides, my mom and my dad, and I was baptized in the Episcopal Church as an infant. But every time I would go to the church, I always felt that the stones that held up this church were like cold and they weren't very living. So I wasn't really fascinated by Christianity. But then in my early 20s, I had several visionary experiences of Jesus, and that got me reacquainted with Christianity that I hadn't seen before. And that led me into the mystical side to the Christian traditions, and I got into Thomas Merton and St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila and Pseudo-Dionysius and the Cloud of Unknowing and a few other of those types of that literature. And I really, really liked it, and I loved it, and I felt very comfortable with it. And then from there, I started to I got into the Gnostics, which was another sect of Christianity, and that led me off into the Western esoteric traditions. And then from there, I really kind of got inspired by wanting to know about the Eastern religions. So I have been involved with this kind of quest of understanding more and more about not only specifically what's going on in Christianity, but also with other world's religions. And then I kind of circled back trying to understand something about Jesus when Dan Brown's book came out, the Da Vinci Code. And I think a lot of people realized that there was something about that book that just sparked people's imagination, that Jesus might have been, that he was married to Mary Magdalene, that there was a lineage, and the lineage was in the south of France and part of the kings of Europe. And I thought, God, you know what? I need to really understand more of the history of what occurred in the first century to understand what this is, what he's really talking about. So I delved into that literature for quite some time. And it wasn't until I started to kind of think on the mystical side again of Christianity when I got into the Gospel of Thomas. And when I really started to delve into that and dig into that, I just started to have all kinds of revelations about the meanings of that material. And with that, since Jesus is supposedly the author of it all, I started to have to ask myself, where is Jesus in the New Testament that is saying the things that I see him saying in the Gospel of Thomas? They're very different, and the Gospel of Thomas is very hard to understand, but I started to understand, what he was talking about, and I didn't see any correlation in the New Testament, and that really got me intrigued. And I have an inquisitive nature that I'm already born with, and so I ask a lot of questions, and I found, just like Plato, when you ask the right questions, they keep leading you further and further or closer and closer to an essential truth. And that's kind of how I got my foot into the ground when I came to understanding Jesus. I started to see him in a very different light than what the New Testament had portrayed him as. And what I can say is that Christianity sees Jesus theologically, and I wanted to understand him from his human side. I wanted to understand his personality and his character traits. And you just can't see that in the New Testament.
My guest this evening is David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man, and we'll be back with more of David after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Tune in to The Practical Intuitive, Mind, Body, Spirit for the Real World with me, host Robin Fritz, Mondays at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 Eastern. I'll cover personal and business intuition, animal communication, mediumship, space clearing, past life regression, shamanic insights, energy healing, soul choice, and more, all to help you tap your own intuitive and healing skills. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Why should you volunteer with Meals on Wheels?
I never thought that 5 minutes could make so much difference in the lives of two people, but it has.
Drop off a warm meal and get more than you expect. Volunteer at americaletsdolunch.org. Brought to you by Meals on Wheels America and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this evening is David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. David, before the break, you were talking about the research process that you started. Was this process revelatory for you?
Yes. I'm always interested in trying to find something new and look at things from a very different point of view and trying to dig down, deep into a particular subject. I've always been that way. I really want to, once I get my kind of hands around something, I really want to know something about it, and I give it a real big bear hug. And when I finally decided I wanted to know more information about Christianity, I ended up looking into the Jesus Seminar and a number of Christian scholars and New Testament scholars. And so I really bore down into this material. And I kept finding more and more information that I found inspirational and inspiring. And there was a new perspective that I hadn't seen before, and that was what was the history like? What was going on in the first century? And that I found that very intriguing.
Now, you reference the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, considered a Gnostic Gospel, and Q, or the Lost Gospel Quill document. For our listeners not familiar with Thomas or Q, please explain these.
Sure. In the 19th century, the German New Testament scholars began to realize that there was probably an earlier text that was inspiring the New Testament, particularly the Gospels. And they surmised that this text was a collection of Jesus' sayings. When you look at the Gospel of Mark, it appears as though Mark has some actions, sayings. And so what they started to realize is that there was this string of pearls in which the string was action and the pearls were the sayings of Jesus. And so they thought, well, what would happen if we just isolated those sayings of Jesus? What do we have here? And that was the beginning of them to understand that there was probably an earlier document that the Christians were using that was nothing but sayings of Jesus. Now, fast forward to the time right after World War II, I'm going to say somewhere around 1947, 48, somewhere right around there, there were two Arab boys that were out looking for fuel to, it was cold outside, and so they were looking for different types of charcoal. And they were digging and they were poking around, and they ended up coming across a jar, and in that jar, when they dug it out, was what we refer to now as the Nag Hammadi Library. So that ended up getting into the hands of the scholars, and one of the books inside this library was a complete version of the Gospel of Thomas, and there are 114 sayings in this gospel, and lo and behold, it's identical in nature to what the German scholars began to believe, that there was a document that was a collection of Jesus' sayings. So there are 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, of which 1/3 of those are sayings that you find in the New Testament. And so that gave credence to the idea that there was an earlier document in which someone recorded Jesus' sayings as opposed to his actions.
Just reflect a little bit on the purpose, the concept of Gnosticism.
This is a big idea. Well, the Gnostics feel that there's two parts. There's the part of the spirit that is supposed to be very pure, and then there's the part of the material world. And kind of as a metaphor, they feel like the material world, the world that we live in, is a bit like quicksand, and that whatever you build on this quicksand is going to fail. So they have a bit of a pessimistic point of view on the nature of the world, because no matter what you build, no matter what you create, in the end, it's going to crumble and it's going to kind of turn into nothing, or all your effort's going to be kind of is going to be vain. But they held on to this idea that there's this divine spark within us, and that if we awaken that spark, it is the same energy, it's the same consciousness, they didn't have those words back then, that is similar to the divine. And it was our responsibility and duty to get in touch with that.
Okay, that's a great explanation. Thank you for sharing that. So both Thomas and Q reflect the voluminous sayings of Jesus. There's a lot of those, aren't there?
Yes. And so what I ended up doing is to understand the subject and to write my book is I took all of Jesus' sayings that you find in the New Testament, that you find in the Gospel of Thomas, and I put them together. Now, there is a group of Christian scholars out there, then they've created what is referred to as the Jesus Seminar, and they put together what they feel as the authentic sayings of Jesus. And I looked at that book and I said, they color coded each of their sayings. So the sayings that are most authentic, they colored red. The sayings of Jesus that they felt were most likely of Jesus's, they color coded pink, and gray for less likely, and black for probably not at all. And so what I did is I looked at what they were recognizing as the authentic sayings of Jesus, or most likely, and I compiled my own list together. And from there, I took that list and I broke it down into categories and subjects. So lo and behold, I asked, okay, how many sayings does Jesus have about the kingdom of heaven? Oh, there are 22. Let's look at the subject of food. How often did he talk about food? Quite a bit. And what about money or treasure? So I found that when I compiled all of these sayings, Jesus spoke about money the most, food the second most, and the kingdom of heaven it came in third.
Now that's fascinating. Why do you think that was the case?
Why do I think that he was talking about money the most?
And food, yeah.
Well, I think that when it came to money, there must have been something very transformative that was taking place within his society, and I think greed was somewhat rampant. And so he chose to address people's needs, and one of them was their misguidedness, so to speak, dealing with money. So I think that was one aspect of it. And of course, if you compare that to, say, the Ten Commandments, greed's really not in there. I mean, envy is and covetousness is, but not greed. So something was taking place within Jesus's country, and probably even in the Mediterranean world with the Romans, that people became more and more greedy.
And what about food?
Well, I think that Jesus, I think, really liked food a lot. So one of the things that I kind of recognized when I developed a personality profile of him is that there was a certain sensuality to him, that he liked certain things, and food and wine seemed to be something that he found pleasure in.
Okay.
And also then you kind of think about what, there might have been people who had plenty of food, and then there were also those who had very little food. So again, that kind of comes into the play on food. So, and then he tied that the idea of food and the idea of money into spiritual sayings.
Now, was it difficult to separate the concept of Jesus the man from the theological Jesus?
Yes. In fact, that was the biggest challenge whatsoever. So part of what I ended up having to do is I said, anything that smells of theology, I have to just put aside. And I don't want to look at that. So I'm gonna separate the theological dimension of Christianity from the sayings of Jesus and the personality that I'm beginning to see and that I'm developing, and what his character traits were. And it was absolutely important to do that. It wasn't easy, but once I went down that road and I said that that's what I was going to do, then the job became a little bit easier. But at first it was very difficult.
In your dialogue with Jesus, there are many points when he asks you why you ask certain questions, or to provide more information about the question. I found that fascinating and wondered how that came into your creative process.
Well, that's a very good question. When I was writing the book, I realized that I was getting in the ballpark of some of the things that occurred to him. So once I developed the personality profile and then I put him back into his the first century context, I can see that there was the conflict. You can see the problems. You can kind of just see the issues that Jesus is grappling with. And that was a revelation for me, so to speak. And there were things that I felt had to have happened, but I couldn't be sure. So I had to refer the question to myself to say, I think this is what happened to you. Because I can't say for certain this happened to him. I can just say these are the things that I felt that was occurring at the time and that he had to grapple with and that he had to address.
And the questioning of clarification is actually a very human trait, isn't it?
It is.
So it really humanizes Jesus.
The whole point was to have this conversation so that we can understand his motives, his past, his philosophy, the issues that he was struggling with or not struggling with, his family, all of those dynamics I found very important. And as I'm getting older, I'm seeing that those patterns have lasting consequences. And they affect us, and they are part of who we are as we get older.
Absolutely. My guest is David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. David, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about your work.
I have a print edition, an ebook, and an audiobook, and all three of those are available at Amazon.com. And please visit my website. It's David Collis, that's COLLIS.com. And I'm also on Facebook.
And we'll be back with more of David Collis and Interviewing Jesus the Man after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
You're listening to OTR FM, part of the IOM radio network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from new thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
I adopted Bento in 2010 from a shelter. A lot of people know him as Keyboard Cat.
That's just one adoption story that started at a shelter. Visit theshelterpetproject.org to find a pet near you. Brought to you by Maddie's Fund, the Humane Society of the United States, and the Ad Council.
Adopt US Kids presents What to Expect When You're Expecting a Teenager. Learning the Lingo.
GOAT, G-O-A-T, acronym, stands for Greatest of All Time. As in, spaghetti sandwiches for dinner? They're my fave. Dad, you're the GOAT.
You don't have to speak teen to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same. Visit adoptuskids.org. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. David, your interview paints a picture of Jesus as someone who had a deep awareness of spiritual concepts of a young man, but was not aware of their source and simply accepted them. How did this shape his later life and ministry? Since I've written the book, I've also had time to marinate over some more issues, and I'm beginning to realize that when the New Testament says that Jesus, after his 40 days in the desert, he was ministered by angels, and then you had the transfiguration on the Mount, I realized that Jesus was probably mystic. Well, I knew he was mystical, but I'm starting to realize that there were probably what we would call today spirit guides around him. And that he had a connection with them. So the other issue is that Jesus had to go through some type of Hebrew training, and I was able to identify that there was a source that he must have been involved in, and that was the Essene. And I'm beginning to realize that his family probably were part of an Essene sect, and that Jesus was very precocious, and he had an ability to understand spiritual concepts much more than many other people, including his parents and a lot of his other siblings and even some of the friends that he had. So I think that he was very unique in that. And I also think that he had the ability to see and hear, what we would refer to as the other side, or spirit beings or angels. So. Now, in your conversation, in your interview with him, you did say he accepts himself as the idea of rabbi, which means teacher in Hebrew, right?
Yes.
And how did he see his role as a rabbi or a teacher?
I think that was probably what he wanted to be up until a certain age, that he might have been interested in, because he was so knowledgeable in Hebrew traditions and in spiritual ideas, that, it would just be natural for him to want to be able to be a teacher and one who would share that information. And so he probably had, several years of education when it comes to Hebrew spirituality.
Now, you have a wonderful scene in this interview. You describe leaving your home at one point and taking Jesus to a local coffee shop for a sandwich and coffee. And while there, he has an encounter with a woman in mourning. Please share that with our listeners and why you included this.
Yeah, so in the book, I wanted to get outside of, essentially, let me just back this up. So the setting is my house, and we're in the den, and I have a library in the den, and I also have a labyrinth in the front of the house. And so as we were talking, I just felt like, we're just sitting in the same spot over and over and over again. And then I thought, well, you know what? I want to get outside of the house. I want to include nature because, Jesus was out and about all the time. So he, the idea of sitting in a house, just having these long conversations, I just felt was a little off, and that he needed to be outside. And I'm at the base of a mountain. So I keep bringing the outdoor inside, and then I wanted to get outdoor. And I just felt it was like I either had a choice of walking up a mountain, or should I go somewhere else, like have coffee somewhere. And I chose that there's a little coffee house right around the corner from where I live. And I thought, after walking the labyrinth, why don't we go get a cup of coffee? So I was thinking of this in my mind. What if we had a cup of coffee at a coffee house while the rain was coming down and we were watching the rain? And so that's how that came about. And so I had to put him in some of my clothes. So we had to take his robe off, put him in my clothes. And then we went into the coffee house, and I set up this woman who was having a very heartfelt, painful experience because she was reminiscing about the death of her sister. And my sister had died a couple of years earlier, and I'm still mourning the loss of her. So I put him into the context of having a heart-to-heart conversation with somebody who has to deal with death. And I felt that was very consistent with the type of character he was.
And the essential nature of what his mission was compassion.
That's correct. It was very heart to heart. He was interested in healing people. He was interested in having an open mind so that people can see something differently and that they didn't have to be afraid. So there's a lot of things in the world that make us afraid, whether it's our poverty or, a foreign invader or your neighbor or what's going on in the world that is becoming more and more frightening, death, disease, old age. There's all those types of things that we're all affected by, and sometimes they overwhelm us. And Jesus wanted to address those issues.
Let me ask you if you can do this, and I wasn't planning on doing this during the course of this interview, but since you brought up the loss of your sister, there's a lot of people right now in our world who are undergoing tremendous losses. I know a lot of people in my age caliber whose parents are transitioning. I know some people who have children who have transitioned under horrible circumstances. What message do you think Jesus would give those people right now?
It's eternal hope. What happens after we die? And he recognized that there was more to life than just our physical life, and that we have another side to us that if we open up and accept and embrace, that we too will start experiencing, the kingdom of heaven. So, we're not here just to live to die. We're here to embrace what these spiritual energies are in this consciousness and embrace all of that. And unfortunately, death is part of our matrix. And that's something that we all have to come to grips with. And so is sickness. I mean, I've been sick many times.
Thank you for sharing that. I think those are very reassuring words for a lot of folks that have sustained loss in the last year. And as you said, it's part of our matrix. It's dying is part of living, and having that sense of completion and also compassion and love after the fact is so important. Now, you spend some time with Jesus discussing why he sought out John the Baptist. And although the New Testament would believe it was just to be baptized and recognized and announced by John, he shares another reason for this. What was that reason?
When I was looking at the John the Baptist and the purpose of John the Baptist, and then I was trying to imagine myself in Jesus' shoes saying, what do I know and what do I bring to the table before I go to John the Baptist? And it dawned on me that Jesus had to have had a very profound experience, a spiritual experience. And he refers to his God as the Father. And so I felt that Jesus knew the Father before he went to John the Baptist. So I had to ask myself, if I knew the Father the way that Jesus was intimate with the Father, with this divinity, the question is why would I need to go to John the Baptist? I already have what it is that I know, unless there's something that John can provide me that I don't have, that I need for my ministry. And it was from that perspective that I started to shape this chapter. There was something about John that Jesus felt that he needed, and he went to see John for that reason. At least that's the way that I see it.
And he didn't have to be baptized. He didn't have to be acknowledged or recognized by John. But there was another reason that he needed to witness John's work. And what was that reason?
My feeling was that John had a conviction, and he had a message, and he had a heart, and he had kind of the heart of a lion, and he was 100% committed to his process and to his ministry and to his message. And John was willing to lay it all on the line for this message and for his God. And I think that there was an element in Jesus that when he looked at John, he said, boy, there's something about him that I feel that I need to have. And that was the conviction, the certitude, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of what it is your ministry had to offer. And I think that there was a little bit of a wavering. I think Jesus had all the knowledge, he had all the wisdom, he had the desire, but there was just something about John that had another quality that Jesus needed to experience and see.
And I sort of took away an even more practical aspect, and that's the fact that John was ministering. And that's something that an experience or a technique or knowledge that perhaps Jesus didn't have up until that point. He had all the spiritual goods, but the practical goods weren't there.
That's right. So I think that there was a little bit of an apprenticeship that's going on, and it had to do with this idea of how one conducts a ministry. So it's very hands-on. And, part of my experience has been in the construction field, so there's a lot of hands-on experience. You can only get so much in a classroom, but eventually you have to get out there and be around the people that have been in this in your field for a long time to really understand what it is that they're understanding and what they have to cope with.
It's interesting that the carpenter and the carpenter's son needed to go to someone else to learn the construction of something totally different, isn't it?
That's right.
Construction.
There's an irony to that, right? How do I construct a ministry? And so there's an aspect of having to construct this ministry in a very hands-on manner. So again, you go back, Jesus has all this knowledge, but he doesn't necessarily have all the practical knowledge. And John has a lot of practical knowledge.
And the other concept that he takes with him is he knows of John's fate and John's suffering. And at the end, when Jesus finds his own fate being fulfilled and his own suffering, he reflects back to John.
That's correct. So there's a couple of things that I saw in the story of John and his relationship with Jesus. And that is the nature of one's death and how that death is going to affect your life and how you're going to move forward from it.
Absolutely. My guest is David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man, and we'll be back with David after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Change and growth are part of natural life, and also part of your spiritual life. Everyone needs support and guidance, especially during life passages. Upgrade yourself with the OMTimes Experts program. With OMTimes Experts, you have access to the best intuitive coaches, spiritual teachers, counselors, astrologists, and oracles. Our team was carefully selected so you can trust. Find out more at experts.omtimes.com.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
Adopt US Kids presents What to Expect When You're Expecting a Teenager. Learning the lingo.
Jelly. Jelly adjective. Jelly is a shorter, better way to say jealous. As in, Chloe, I am like so jelly of your unicorn phone case.
You don't have to speak teen to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will love you just the same. Visit adoptuskids.org, brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
You're not wired to have a response to this sound. You're neutral to it, and you can hear it repeatedly without feeling anything. But when we introduce a new stimulus, save the food, we've achieved pulling a natural or inborn response from you. Save the food. Why are we doing this, you may ask? Save the food. Because this ad is trying to change the world's behavior through brainwashing. Because 40% of all food in the US never gets eaten. Save the food. And that costs a family of four $1,500 a year. Save the food. Cha-ching. It's worsening climate change through the release of methane gas. Save the food. Cha-ching. And it's wasting precious natural resources like our fresh water. Save the food. Cha-ching. So when you hear this sound, don't be neutral. Rethink your behavior. Cook it, store it, share it. Just don't waste it. For tips and recipes, visit SaveTheFood.com. Brought to you by NRDC and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this evening, David Collis, the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. And David, before the break, we were talking about the connection between John the Baptist and Jesus, specifically in terms of the end of life and the transition. Please go ahead with that thought.
There are a couple of issues that I found very important as I was writing the book and as I was researching the book. And it was Jesus' relationship with John the Baptist. And there were two parts to this that I found very intriguing and very important. So once John is arrested, Jesus finds out after he has gone to his 40 days in the desert, and he's now starting his own ministry in which he went. He started off in his kind of near his hometown, and then he was kicked out. He went to another town and went to the synagogue and spoke there, and he was kicked out. And so he was spending time ministering and being kicked out of these towns and villages. And then he gets news that John was arrested and then he was killed. And I thought, gee, if Jesus has a message, what would happen if Jesus kind of got really frustrated and angry and tried to revolt against Herod and used all of Jesus or John's disciples to carry out some form of insurrection? And I started to realize that if Jesus did something like that, then there would have been no ministry of the Father. There would have been no ministry of, his compassion and his love and his message and his miracles and his story and his wisdom. There wouldn't have been any of that. It would have been caught up in this insurrection mode. And so Jesus rightly had to separate himself from John. And you see in the synoptic gospels that Jesus, went away. He went up to Tyre and Sidon and later came back and dealt with the collection of his own disciples. So there was something very important for Jesus to move away from when it came to John and separate himself from that. Now, when it's time for Jesus to die, there was something very important that Jesus is recognizing. At least this is the way that I'm seeing it, and that is John was arrested, and then he was thrown in jail, and then he was executed in a dungeon. And there was nothing public about that whatsoever, except the fact that, Herod is holding up his head. And when it was time for Jesus to die, I felt that Jesus wanted to have his death as public as possible, so that it was a testament to his story.
Yes.
As opposed to being executed in private or ripped apart by the Roman centurions in some other way, in which he then just kind of got scattered to the winds. I just think that there was something that Jesus planned on wanting to have it as visible as possible.
And the message would not be as strong a delivery message if it had not been a public execution.
That's correct. So there's a certain element of theater here where Jesus is recognizing that the maximum kind of punch, so to speak, is what he is looking for.
The Jesus you interview is a strong, determined, and driven man. He had a mission, and he knew he had to pursue it. How did you come to this view of Jesus?
Well, first of all, I looked at him and I went, he has an open mind. He has an open heart. He is brave, courageous, and fearless. And he's performing all these miracles. And I kept on thinking, what's it like when you walk into a big group of people and you're the one in charge? Hey, to this person who is lame, pick up your mat and walk. I just went, boy, that's really bold. So there's a certain element of fearlessness and there's a certain element of courageousness and just boldness that Jesus embodied when he conducted his ministry. He would go up to anybody and start talking. And I went, well, I have to really appreciate and understand that personality trait in him. And that was something that really kind of started to resonate, that as I was looking at his ministry, I got this impression that he was like shot out of a cannon, and he was conducting his ministry as if he were on a military campaign. So there was a precision to it, and there was a preciseness to it, and there was a kind of a grittiness to it and a forcefulness to it. And it just had to be this way for him to make the change that he wanted to make. And he couldn't be passive in this. He had to be very aggressive.
Now, you seem to allude to his final correction being the need to let go of ego.
Yes. So here we have one of those inspirations that I found from the East, and this is the Buddhist concept. So there's a number of sayings that Jesus has that are from the East. There's some Taoist ideas, there's Buddhist ideas, there's Hindu ideas, and there's Confucian ideas. But what struck me the most is that Jesus' ministry had a very had a Buddhist concept to it, and that is, the more I give of myself, the less I become, and the more the divine, the Father, is infused in me, and he is moving through me. And that is a Buddhist concept of getting rid of the ego. And I saw Jesus was doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. What did he tell you was his interpretation of the nature of his mission?
The nature of the mission was to enlighten people about who they are. They are the pearl that is buried in a field, and when they recognize that pearl, that they too are going to recognize the power that God has in their lives. That was one. Two, that Jesus was interested in transmuting his own life, so that the more he transmuted himself, the more the divine took over. And what we find at the very end of this story, of this transmutation of, matter, is that you become pure gold. There's a form of ascension that takes place. And that is just something that the Christian message is a part of, but they really don't. I think that they have missed the point of that. And I kind of felt like it was important to rekindle that idea that there is something to be said about compassion, love, wisdom, fearlessness, and that by doing that, you can actually overcome your own situation and your own humanity and be infused with the divine. And that seems to be Jesus' example.
What did he mean by saying the kingdom of God is within you?
Very good. Okay, so we have two natures. We have a human nature, and we have this divine, godlike nature in us that's part creative. And he recognized that the creator, the source, is infused in us. We're part of the natural order. And that the more we recognize that we are part of this order, the more we are connected to the energies of heaven, which are it extends beyond our humanity. And so he recognized that there was this kind of a lower nature to us, and that lower nature is greed and lust and envy and covetousness. And he wanted to infuse people and himself with wisdom, patience, peace, love, recognition of the divine, experiencing the divine. So all of that was part of the kingdom of heaven for him. It wasn't some faraway place you go to after you die. It's right here, right now. And it's not in the temple. He had a bit of a problem with the temple priests and the temple concepts. And so the monopoly was that God was sitting in the holies of holies, and Jesus is downplaying that concept.
Absolutely.
Quite a bit.
Absolutely.
Quite a bit. So the kingdom of heaven is inside of you. You are the Holy of Holies. So how do you become your own temple?
David, interviewing Jesus the man must have had a profound change on you. What changes did you find in yourself?
There was many things that I understood before I wrote the book. And then as I started to write the book, there was just this intimacy that I connected to him with. And I started to recognize that there are things about my life that coincided with him. Jesus seemed to have come with or was born into a family that was somewhat wealthy. I'm not going to say super wealthy, but they were with means, and that they had something to do with farming and construction. I had my grandparents, my great-grandparents were ranchers, and they had orchards, a ranch, and then I also had the building. So I'm kind of connecting, my history to his history. I'm also a mystic, and I realize that he's a mystic. I've had some really bad experiences, and I'm noticing that he also had some bad experiences. He left home, and then had some profound experiences, both good and bad, that really kind of shaped who he was later in his life. And I went, boy, that's very similar to mine. And I think I was just recognizing that the patterns that he lived and the things that he understood, I started to recognize that I too am on a similar path. And that kind of shook me to my core.
What would you like readers to take away from interviewing Jesus the man?
One, that Jesus is a man, that he is living his life for the divine, and that the things that he did and what he knew and what he was capable of doing are all within us, and also that we also can have an experience of the divine and be motivated by the divine and be directed by the divine. And that we have to clear ourselves so that we can see that and experience that. And that he's our example of how this can happen.
Wonderful message, especially in today's world where we need compassion, love, and understanding. My guest, David Collis, is the author of Interviewing Jesus the Man. David, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you.
My book is Interviewing Jesus the Man. It's the print copy, the ebook, and the audiobook are at Amazon.com. And then my website is www.davidcollis.com, and my Facebook page is David Collis Author.
David, to you and yours, a very joyous Christmas, and thank you for sharing this wonderful work with us.
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Victor.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor the Voice Furman. Have a wonderful week.